SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India. SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome to the talk on Airline Deregulation Act as part of the course on air transportation. In every field, there are some activities or events which have a path breaking influence in that particular field. In the field of civil aviation, especially with respect to the civil aviation in the USA, this particular act called as the Airline Deregulation Act had that path breaking influence. So, it is important for us to get some idea about this major historical initiative. First of all, since we are talking about airline deregulation, let us understand the meaning of the word deregulation. Deregulation basically means the act or process of removing restrictions and regulations. So, you can imagine that when there was regulation, there were many constraints, there were many restrictions, and when several of these were removed, that act can be called as the act of deregulation. This path breaking act was passed by the US Senate in 1978 and it is known as ADA or the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. It had a huge influence in the world's largest aviation market, which is the US, and the ripple effect of that was felt all across the globe, and therefore, we are going to have a look at this particular act. So, today we are going to look at what is meant by ADA or the Airline Deregulation Act, who passed this act, what were the consequences of this particular act. There were some positive impacts and also there were some negative impacts, and it is a matter of debate whether the positive effects were more or the negative effects were more. So, we will not get into the debate, but we will present in front of you some arguments for both the impacts, and then you can make your own conclusions. Let us take a deep dive into the history of aviation industry, especially with respect to the history of what happened in the US. In 1925, around 22 years after the Wright brothers were able to successfully fly an aircraft, the Kelly Act was enacted, and as per this act, private airlines were permitted to transport airmail apart from transporting passengers. So, in 1930, the Airmail Act was enacted, in which the postmaster of a particular post office was given the authority of deciding who is going to carry the airmail from that particular post office to other post offices. under the Airmail Act, the authority was given to the postmaster. So, now when you give authority of deciding a commercial activity such as carriage of airmail, which can make a huge difference to the bottom line of an airline, then there is prone to be a possibility of misuse. So, 3 years later, a scandal was detected when a particular postmaster exceeded the authority, and this particular incident or this particular event is called as the spoils conference. Perhaps the meaning is that the spoils of this particular decision were being misused by this particular postmaster. Okay. So, in the late 30s, this authority given to the postmasters was then revoked, and a civil aviation board was created, which was the prime regulator of aviation industry in the US till about late 1970s. So, the Civil Aviation Board set up in 1938 and dissolved in 1985. What was the jurisdiction of the Civil Aviation Board, or CAB as we call it in short? CAB was given the authority to fix the airfares from on a particular route by the airlines. So, the fare was not fixed by the airline based on the market, based on the competition, based on the demand. There was a fixed number arrived at by Civil Aviation Board, and that was the amount that had to be charged by an airline. Okay. CAB also determined on which routes the airlines will fly. CAB effectively limited the entry of new airlines, because CAB was given the authority of giving the license or the permission to determine the routes, to allow a particular entry, and to also fix the fares. So, this became a barrier to the entry. CAB also took the power from the postmasters and allotted airmail routes to various airlines. Now, one can debate on how they went about deciding whom to give. One can always imagine that when you have authority like this, there could be misuse of power. All this is debatable. CAB also insisted on particular routes to be flown, whether or not those routes were commercially viable. So, if an airline wanted to fly a particular route, some other routes were made as a compulsory route to be flown by that airline because of the unchallenged power of CABs. In short, all aspects of air transportation in the US were regulated by this body called as the Civil Aviation Board. So, when you have such vast authority with far reaching economical consequences, there is always a possibility of a bureaucratic complacency to be setting in. So, there are many accusations that CAB became very bureaucratic, and I will give you just one example. This is called in air transportation history as the stale request of World Airways. World Airways was an airline which no longer exists, which as you can see used to operate aircraft like the Boeing 747, which is there on the screen. So, in 1967, this particular airline made a request to CAB saying that we would like to fly a particular route which is from New York to Los Angeles. This is a very popular and a very high demand route. There is a lot of demand between New York and Los Angeles even today. It is a lucrative route for most airlines. So, therefore, World Airways in 1967 requested CAB to give permission. As I told, CAB had the complete authority of deciding which routes to be followed, who will be allowed to fly, and all other decisions. CAB did not reply to the airline till 1973. Okay, imagine 6 years there was no reply, and in 1973 they refused permission for the airline to fly this particular route. So, because the request was so old, it is considered in air transportation literature as a stale request. So, this is an example of the bureaucratic delay that came about because of cab. So, yes, there were many complaints about cab from airlines, and then in 1973 there was a massive oil crisis which especially hit the airlines of the United States of America. So, what happened is there was an Arab-Israel war, and because of that the oil and petroleum countries, OPEC countries, they refused to supply oil to the US and to the aviation industry. So, there was a huge oil crisis. Okay. So, CAB or cab was approached by the airlines to help out. Okay. People could not afford aviation, the whole industry collapsed because really cab could not do much about it, it was an extraneous influence. Okay. So, in 1978 this Airline Deregulation Act was passed. So, who passed this act? We will see that in the next slide. So, under this particular act, the role of cab was re-looked at, and so the safety aspects of the Civil Aviation Board or cab were removed, and the new agency called FAA was created, whose main focus was on standardization and safety, and the decision regarding what fares to offer, which routes to fly, what schedules to follow, those were taken away from cab and left to market forces. So, the authority of cab was severely diminished because of the massive complaints that were received, and the market forces were allowed to dictate what fares, what routes, and how the schedules would be followed by the airlines. So, going back a little bit in history and looking at some personalities involved in ADA. So, the ADA was passed by Jimmy Carter, who was at that time the President of the United States of America. So, what he did is he appointed Alfred E. Kahn as the chair of cab and asked him to look into deregulating of the air transportation sector. So, Alfred Kahn appointed Dan McKinnon as the last chairman of cab, then the cab was dissolved and the Airline Deregulation Act was passed. So, let us quickly recall what exactly is Airline Deregulation Act. It is an act by the Senate of the US to deregulate the aviation sector. The history is that the Civil Aviation Board became very powerful and in many ways it became bureaucratic also. So, and the problems were compounded by the oil crisis of the 70s, mid 70s. Because of that, the US Senate under the leadership of the then President Jimmy Carter passed this particular act. So, what are the goals of this act? The goals of ADA. One of the main aims of ADA was to maintain safety in operation of the aircraft. The second aim was to free the market from the diktats of cab and to rely on competition, to encourage the growth of civil aviation and to remove the barrier of entry from new people entering the airline business, to avoid concentration of the aviation industry in few companies or few hands, so that it can be a uniform playing field, and hence to encourage new players to enter the market and compete, and may the best financial market win. That was the aim of, that was the goal of setting up AD. Now, that was the goal of setting up ADA. Now, what are the consequences of ADA? Any act or any decision or any act which is passed always has some consequences, some positive, some negative. It is a mixed bag. So, let us look at some of the consequences of ADA. The first consequence of ADA was that the authority with the cab to set the fares was removed. So, now the fares are determined purely by market forces. Then the bureaucratic delays which were there, and as explained by an example of the stale request of World Airways, the processing was expedited and therefore delays or bureaucracy was reduced. Some of the routes which were underutilized because the cab did not give permission for whatever reason to operate on those routes were allowed, and that enabled the expansion of the networks of many airlines. And obviously, if an airline decides to operate on a particular route, a particular frequency, a particular aircraft, and if it is not profitable, after some time they would stop operating on those. So, the market forces would automatically take care. Wherever the market demands transportation, people will try to fill that gap, and wherever it does not work out, they will stop. So, the market forces will ultimately take care of the growth of civil aviation. The safety standards proposed by cabs or implemented by cabs, now they were taken away and given to the new agency. The safety was given to FAA, and after cab was dismantled, some new roles were given to DOT, which is the Department of Transport. So, what is DOT? DOT is an agency of the government of US, and we will talk about it in more details when we look at aviation organizations. The mission of DOT is to deliver the world's leading transportation system serving the American people and economy through safe, efficient, sustainable and equitable movement of people and goods. Okay. So, these are some of the important points which are kept in mind by DOT. Okay. The airlines were categorized based on their annual revenues. They were categorized as major airlines or national airlines or regional airlines. So, let us have a look at how the categorization works. Depending on the annual revenue obtained in US dollars, and regional airline, which is the lowest level in this particular categorization, if you are doing an annual revenue of 20 million USD to 100 million USD, you would be termed as a regional airline. If you are doing upwards of 100 million up to 1 billion, you are considered as a national airline, and if your revenue is more than 1 billion, annual revenue is more than 1 billion, then you are categorized as a major airline. So, this categorization was brought about as per the ADA. Okay. Now, CAB had prohibited introduction of new rules, or it was in a way arbitrary. Permissions were given to some, denied to some. So, the Airline Deregulation Act came about to introduce rules to charter trips and also opened up several new routes. Okay. See, the mutual aid agreements between air carriers, they were terminated. Okay. What are these mutual aid agreements? So, in a mutual aid agreement, basically two airlines, they join hands together, or two agencies in the aviation sector join hands together, and they work in a way in cahoots with each other. So, let us say one carrier receives payment from another. Okay. The only condition at that time was that it should not be dealing with foreign air transportation. As long as you are in the domestic sector, you are allowed to receive payment from another airline. So, these kind of agreements, they were terminated by the CAB. Similarly, there were antitrust immunities between carriers, these were granted. Okay. So, basically the Civil Aviation Board, so the antitrust alliances basically means the airline can market seats on some of its partners' flights. For example, if there is an agreement between airline A and airline B, then airline A is permitted by airline B to sell some of the seats that it is offering it allows the B allows A to sell those seats because A has a captive base of customers. So, B says that okay, some of my seats you are allowed to sell. Okay. So, this is great. Okay. This is great because it gives travel benefits and lower price to the customers, because customers now have a wider choice. But because of this, the competition that occurs between airlines, which ultimately leads to efficient operations and reduction in the fares, that is lost. So, if you have antitrust alliances between two airlines, then effectively they are working together and therefore, the competition is reduced. Okay. So, CAB was given the power to grant antitrust immunity between carriers, and also there was a problem in the aviation industry at that time, that people were terminated very quickly if the market. So, let us say an airline opens up a new route and you find after some time that that route is not profitable, you simply fire everybody. So, when ADA was created, there was an attempt to ensure that the air carriers give preference to terminated employees when hiring. Okay. Instead of just using hire and fire, they were required to give priority and preference to the experienced airline crew who had already been working with them or with other airlines. FAA was set up to come up with safety standards, and there was a specific class of airlines called as the commuter airlines, which had a very poor safety record, and also lots of accidents were taking place. So, therefore, the FAA had to develop safety standards for commuter airlines. Let us have a look at what these airlines are and what is special about them. So, commuter airlines are airlines in which most of the passengers are commuters. Now, what do you mean by commuters? Commuters are passengers who travel from home to work and back by air on a regular basis. For example, there are people who commute from San Francisco airport to Los Angeles airport in a flight that takes about 45 minutes, and there are these 5 airlines which are operating between these two airports. Similarly, from San Diego to Los Angeles, which is a 60-minute flight, 1-hour flight, again you have many of these airlines who operate. Road travel takes much longer time. From Burbank to Oakland, it takes about an hour and 15 minutes on a flight, and again we have about 5 airlines operating on these routes and competing with each other. So, these are people who are regularly going, regularly commuting. Generally speaking, all over the world, for these short frequent flights, we use small regional airports. From there we go to the hub airport. Okay. For example, LAX is a hub. Okay. Now, generally speaking, small aircraft such as CRJ 200 or ERJ 145, which have around 50 seats, or Beechcraft 1900 or Dornier 228, which have around 19 seats. These are the ones which are normally preferred for commuting between small city to a large hub, or even between two small cities. So, these aircraft, they are very peculiar and they have certain interesting features, and in fact, my own research during my doctoral studies was on looking at short haul twin turboprop aircraft, mostly commuters and regional aircraft. Okay. You can actually get a copy of my thesis, which is available online on the Cranfield University website. Just to give you a very brief idea, what I worked on is generalized cost optimization of short haul twin turboprop aircraft, including airport considerations. I did it from the College of Aeronautics in Cranfield University. I passed out in 1997. So, this particular study focuses on optimization of these configurations, keeping in mind the generalized cost of travel. The generalized cost of travel basically means the total cost that you incur when you take a journey, and we will talk a great detail about generalized cost of travel, and you can see in the last line in the title it says airport considerations. So, when I actually talk to you about airport sizing, airport layout and design, I am going to talk about airports suitable for commuter and regional aircraft, and that is when we will revisit these concepts once again. Moving ahead, let us look at the effects of the Airline Deregulation Act. As I said, the effects can be considered to be both positive as well as negative, because every act or every action that you take, it has its repercussions both in the positive and the negative side. Okay. Let us first look at the positive impacts of the ADA. Okay. The bottom line is that the introduction of ADA removed the monopoly and in some ways the nexus between airlines and the Civil Aviation Board, and it resulted in market forces entering the field of air transportation in a very big way, and therefore lowering the overall prices. Here is a graph that shows how the prices went from 1979 to around 2005. We noticed that apart from the initial rise in the prices when the industry was settling down and getting into the consolidation, general trend of the prices is downward. In fact, the fare per passenger reduced by 9% from 1979 to 1994, and it reduced by as much as 40% from 1979 to 2005. So, by and large there was a huge reduction in the overall prices. Okay. Then because the market was consolidated and market forces ensured that airlines operated efficiently, the passenger load factors increased. What is meant by load factor in an aircraft or in airline operation? Load factor essentially is the percentage of aircraft seats or the percentage of the cargo space which is occupied in a flight. So, if you are operating with load factor of 80%, it means if you have 100 seats, you are having 80 people flying and 20% seats are vacant. All airlines try to maximize their load factor, but it is not good to always aim for 100% load factor. We will talk about it when we discuss more about the airline operations. So, anyway, load factors must be high to ensure commercial viability of the airline. So, now when new airlines came up, especially the commuter airlines that came up, and they were allowed to choose aircraft matching with the routes that they are operating. For example, they were able to use smaller aircraft for lower traffic routes such as the commuter and regional routes. So, therefore, the passenger load factor increased, and when the load factor increases, the profitability of the airline also increases. Okay. So, this was a positive impact. Another positive impact was that there were lower barriers to entry and exit. Okay. In a business, there has to be lesser barrier for both entry as well as exit. It should not be that once you enter the business, it is very difficult for you to exit it, and also it should not be that it is very difficult for you to enter the business in the first place. So, by the introduction of the Airline Deregulation Act, by removing the authority of the cab to decide everything, who will fly, where you will fly, how much you will charge, what frequency you will offer, leaving it to market forces led to the higher competition, and the market forces were deciding the fares, and because of that competition increased by a huge amount. Many new airlines entered the market either as individuals or through merger with the major players, but also many airlines lost out. Okay. So, a list of airlines which entered the market because of lowering of the barrier to entry is quite a large one, and some of them are even operating till today and are very successful. Some of them have no longer existed, but it is okay. The market forces decided which airline will stay and which airline will prosper. Okay. One of the outcomes of the Airline Deregulation Act allowing airlines to choose what to operate and where to operate is the propensity of the hub and spoke networks in air transportation. So, before deregulation, because CAB was deciding which routes to follow, there was generally a point to point travel between various cities to other cities. Okay. So, this was what was before deregulation the situation. After deregulation, the airlines slowly, most airlines slowly converge into this particular model, which is commonly referred to as the hub and the spoke model. In the hub and spoke model, as you can see in the figure below, there are two hub airports shown in the red dot and in the blue dot. This is the red dot, this is the blue dot. So, all the other airports shown in the green dots here are the spokes which are feeding traffic to the hubs, and then once these small aircraft from various spokes feed aircraft passengers to the hub consolidates all of them together into a bigger aircraft and flies from one hub to the other, and then from the other hub it then again transports passengers to the other destinations via small aircraft to the various spokes. So, this is called as a hub and spoke network. An example of that is the hub and spoke network that you see here, where Denver and Los Angeles are two major hubs, and all the flights are now converging and diverging from these hubs. For example, if somebody wants to fly from San Francisco to Atlanta, okay, through this particular airlines network, they will have to go from San Francisco to Denver and change the plane and then travel from Denver to Atlanta. Okay. Because the airline, this particular airline is not offering a direct connection from San Francisco to Atlanta. Similarly, if somebody wants to go, so people from Minneapolis, St. Paul or Milwaukee or Chicago Midway or St. Louis or Dallas Fort Worth, if they want to go to Seattle, they all have to take the flight to Denver and then take another flight to Seattle. So, there are positives and negatives of hub and spoke network, as we will see, but this is what has come about, and the Airline Deregulation Act is considered as one of the major factors in resulting in this particular kind of a network. Okay. So, let us have a quick comparison between the hub and spoke versus the point to point. In point to point, you have a connection from one city to the other, and that is called point to point. Hub and spoke is what we discussed. So, both of them transport passengers from one point to another, that is not a problem. The difference is that in hub and spoke, airlines have to develop different banks of flight arrivals. So, they have to schedule in such a way that all the flights from the spokes arrive at the hub within a small time, so that the net time of the passenger is not increased. Okay. And also, if you do not arrive punctually, then how long can a flight from the hub to the other hub wait for people to come. So, if you are punctual, then you will be able to bring everyone together within a small time window. They will be able to change the planes and go to the major the hub aircraft or the larger aircraft and travel. And in point to point flights, we have to stop, flights have to stop at different locations. Yeah, because in point to point you have to go from A to B, then B to C, then C to D, then D to E. Whereas in hub and spoke, you can go from A to hub and hub to the spoke. Okay. So, that is the basic difference. What are the advantages of hub and spoke network? First of all, you allow economies of scale on connections. You can allow smaller aircraft to operate, you can allow customized aircraft to operate, and you are providing large connectivity from every point in the spoke. The other spoke now gets a connection. It is possible to fly, okay. Whereas there is no demand to fly directly, but you still have an ability to fly. Okay. Then there is an economy of scale at the hubs, because at the hub airport now you can operate larger aircraft between two hubs. So, this large aircraft with let us say 300 seats, it will have 20 passengers from one spoke, 30 from one spoke, 10 from the fourth spoke, etc., etc., and it will fill up the passengers from all these spokes, Now, these passengers are also meant for different destination spokes. Okay. So, they will all be together, they will board the flight together, get down at the other spoke airport, and then again the traffic will be bifurcated or distributed to the spokes. So, there is the economy of scale at the hubs also, and then there is the economy of scope in the use of shared transshipment facilities, because now the hub airport has facilities available for transshipment, and those can be optimized and used. So, these are the advantages of hub and spoke network. Effect of COVID. Now, COVID actually led to a huge effect on the hub and spoke model. Point to point travel was on the decline during the COVID time, but post COVID there is a re-emergence and growth of hub and spoke is likely to continue, because point to point travel actually is what passengers generally prefer. Unfortunately, for it to be commercially viable, there has to be enough market demand. If there is no market demand, or the market demands are very limited, airlines are forced to follow the hub and spoke model. Let us also look at some negative impacts of the ADA. Okay. So, because of the Airline Deregulation Act, airlines acquired a huge ability to hire and fire people. So, net earning of the labor declined by around 10%. Okay. Because there was poor labor management and bad service, therefore, and there were many strikes by the maintenance personnel, strike by the pilot, and strikes by the other crew. Because of that, there was a lot of industrial discomfort and dispute in the industry. Okay. Moving on, let us also look at some negative impacts of the hub and spoke network. Hub and spoke leads to overcrowding, because to match the departure from one hub airport to the other, all these spokes have to now schedule flights at sometimes very inconvenient hours, so that during one particular time window there will be lot of people at the airport, it will lead to overcrowding, and then once the consolidation of passengers takes place and they fly from one hub to the other, there can be large time windows of no activity at the airport. So, the traffic comes in large numbers in waves, and this leads to overcrowding. Okay. Whatever you may say, there are going to be some flights which are delayed, and it is commercially very difficult for an airline to say that we will proceed without waiting for the arriving spokes. So, therefore, there are some delays, and these delays can mount up and become very discomforting for the passengers. To coordinate the various flights from various spokes to the hub and to ensure that they all come in the time at same time or the assigned time, it is not very easy. So, therefore, there is always delays. And the other thing is that since large number of people are present in an airport at a particular given time, that becomes very attractive for terrorists or other miscreants to cause problems, because they know that there will be large number of people present. So, imagine if there is a departure of a hub aircraft to another hub aircraft at 10 o'clock, then from maybe 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock there will be large number of people at the airport. Similarly, when this aircraft reaches the destination, again there will be large number of people, because many people are going to connect to this aircraft when it comes back, and many of them are going to be there because they will be disembarking. So, it leads to higher risk of terror attacks. Okay. Then there were also some other negative impacts of ADA, very volatile financial performance. In fact, the US airline collectively lost $60 billion. Okay. We only hear about the profitability aspects or the good aspects of ADA, but we should also remember that many airlines were wiped out, and many of them also lost a lot of money. So, there was also a problem. So, what are the factors that caused poor performance of the airlines? Okay. One is that the performance of an airline or the profitability of the airline is directly coupled to the economy of the country or the region. It has linked to the GDP of the region. Okay. Then there was a cut in the capacity, scheduling and workforce because airlines wanted to minimize on their operating costs, right. They were reluctant to raise fares because raising fares means they would become inferior in the competition with the other airlines. So, even though they were making losses, they were not able to make increases in the fare, because if they do that they will lose further the market, this is what they thought. So, therefore, they kept on losing. Then there were some demand shocks, events such as 9/11 take place, and because of that these are externalities which take place, and we will look at it in more detail in one of the future lectures about how the aerospace or about how the airline industry is very resilient to external attacks. And there are certain external or exogenous cost drivers like jet fuel on which the airline has no control. Yes, they can do some hedging of their expenses on fuel, but there is a limit to how much you can save with that. So, because of many of these factors, airlines end up either folding up or merging with other airlines and having loose performance. Here is an example of how the fuel price has varied from 1970 to 2010. You can see that there was a major oil crisis in 1973 or 74 when the prices were increased 3 times from 0.5 to 1.5 suddenly, and then after that there was a drop, and again there was an increase, and airlines have to take care of these changes. Okay. So, this opens up a very interesting research question for those of you who are trying to look at air transportation as an interesting subject to research on. The question is that there was something called Airline Deregulation Act. Have the positive effects of ADA outweighed the negative effects? It is a research question. Okay. Then the second point is that the role of the government is continuously debated. Should the government have a direct intervention in the market, or should it leave it to the free market? There are champions of both. Okay. So, today the tendency is to move more towards the free market, allowing market forces to take care. It is simply because many governments are not in a position, even if they want, to really pump money, because this is a very volatile field. Okay. So, by default nowadays there is a more push towards free market, but it is still an open question on whether, for the keeping in mind the interest of the public at large and ensuring that there is safe and orderly transportation system available to travel people by air, should there be a direct and a continuous intervention by the government. Okay. So, with that we come to the end. Thanks for your attention, and I hope you have enjoyed this session where we talked about the Airline Deregulation Act, about the history on how it was brought about, who brought it about, how was it implemented, what were the steps taken, and also the positive and the negative effects of the Airline Deregulation Act. Finally, there is an open research question on whether it was really beneficial on the whole, because as I mentioned, although it allowed birth of many new airlines, several existing airlines had to die, and there was a huge loss, about $60 billion to the entire industry. So, was it really beneficial or was it detrimental? That is an open question. Thank you so much.